a story of the legendary King of the Britons. How Arthur pulled the sword from the stone. Stories of the exploits of Arthur and his valiant companions go back to the Dark Ages. They were first gathered together in a best-selling book, Le Morte d'Arthur, by Sir Thomas Malory in 1470. Nowadays, Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table are popularly shown as dressed in full armour and living in stone castles, as kings and knights did in the days of Malory. Present historical opinion places Arthur not as a king, but as a successful war chief, living and fighting at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain. Many hundreds of years ago, Uther Pendragon was king of England. Those were troubled and warlike days. The king was constantly fighting and roving from one end of the land to the other. Thus it happened that when a baby son was born to King Uther and his wife Igraine, the child was given to Merlin, the magician, to bring up in safety. Merlin took up the boy, named Arthur, and put him in the care of a knight called Sir Ector. Sir Ector was not an important nobleman, but he was honest and kind. He already had a son called Kay, and Arthur was brought up as Kay's younger brother. In the usual way of things in those days, Arthur would have lived with Sir Ector until he was 10 or 12 years old, and then returned to the court of his father to be trained as a fighting prince. Barely 2 years after Arthur had been given to Merlin, King Uther died. The kingdom fell into chaos, with one great duke fighting another, and with everyone fighting the foreign invaders, who constantly harried the shore. Those who were aware that the little Prince Arthur existed knew nothing of his whereabouts. Sir Ector knew that the boy in his care was the son of an important nobleman. But he did not know Arthur was the son of King Uther. So the years went by, with Arthur living happily on Sir Ector's small estate far in the country, and England was in turmoil because there was no strong king to keep order. At last, Merlin the magician visited the Archbishop of Canterbury, and counselled him to send for all the lords of the realm and all the gentlemen of arms to meet in London at Christmas. As our Lord Jesus was born by a miracle on that night, perhaps out of his mercy, he will show us, by a miracle, who should be king of this troubled realm, said Merlin. The Archbishop of Canterbury agreed, and all the nobles, great and small, were called to meet in London by Christmas Day, or risk being put under the curse of the church. Several days before Christmas, the nobles assembled at the great church of St. Paul to ask God to listen to their prayers and to help them to choose a worthy king. When they came out of the church, they saw an amazing sight. A huge stone stood 4 square in the churchyard, where no stone had stood before. Embedded in the stone was an anvil of steel, a foot high. pushed into the anvil was a fair sword, and written round the sword in gold were the words, "Whosoever pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England." Everyone was amazed. Some of the nobles ran to fetch the archbishop. "God has given us a sign," he said. "We must pray once more, and then those who think themselves fit to be king may try to pull the sword from the anvil and the stone." Many great nobles tried to pull the sword from the stone, but none succeeded. "The man who can claim the sword is not yet here," said the archbishop. "God will send him. Meanwhile, let 10 knights of good repute take turns to guard the sword." So it was agreed. Then Merlin the magician again spoke secretly to the archbishop. "A tournament should be arranged for New Year's Day," he said. "Otherwise those who have not succeeded in pulling the sword from the stone will become bored and go home. All the nobles must be here to acclaim the rightful king, when at last he is found. Moreover, a tournament will attract many people. Surely the boy born to the king will be amongst them." The Archbishop of Canterbury agreed to this, and so it was arranged. Talk of the great meeting in London and the tournament on New Year's Day had reached the ears of quiet-loving Sir Ector. He rode to London with his son Sir Kay, who had been made a knight at the Hallowmas before. Young Arthur, who was not yet old enough to be a knight, rode as a squire to his brother Sir Kay. London was of course very crowded, and Sir Ector had to take lodgings far out of the city. On the day of the great tournament, Sir Ector, Sir Kay, and Arthur rode into town. Suddenly Sir Kay gasped, "Arthur, I have forgotten my sword! I cannot fight without it. Please go back to our lodgings and fetch it for me. If I ride back, I shall be tired before the tournament starts." "Very well," agreed Arthur, who was a good-natured lad. In any case, it was his duty as a squire to serve his brother. Arthur rode back along the road as quickly as he could. When he reached the lodging-house, he found to his dismay that it was locked and shuttered. "The lady of the house has gone to watch the tournament," called a child, playing in a nearby field. "There is no way of getting into that house until she returns tonight." Upset, Arthur rode back towards the jousting field. Without a sword, Kay would not be able to take part in the tournament. It was all very upsetting. As he rode past St. Paul's churchyard, Arthur saw a magnificent sword sticking in an anvil high on a huge stone. "Well, whoever owns that sword cannot want it very much to leave it lying about like that," thought Arthur. "I will pull it out and take it to my brother Kay, and he will have a fair sword with which to fight in the tournament." Tying up his horse, Arthur climbed onto the stone, seized hold of the sword with both his hands, and heaved it from the anvil. Then, remounting onto his horse, he hurried to catch up with Sir Ector and Sir Kay. The sword Arthur held in his hands was, of course, the magic sword, which he had found unguarded because all the knights were at the jousting. "Kay! Kay!" called Arthur, spurring up beside his brother. The lodging-house was locked, and I could not fetch your own sword, but I found this fair sword left pushed in an anvil. Will it do for you?" By this time Sir Kay had been talking with other knights and nobles, and he had heard all about the sword in the stone. "Did you get this sword from St. Paul's churchyard?" he asked Arthur. I'm not sure," replied Arthur. "You know, I have never been to London before, but it was a fine big church. Besides, if people leave good swords lying about pushed into stones, they deserve to lose them. That is your sword now, Kay. You use it and win." Kay was a good young man, but for once temptation was too great for him. He went to his father, Sir Ector, and showed him the sword. "Father," he said, "I have the sword from the stone. Therefore, I must be King of England." Sir Ector looked at the sword and looked at his son. He knew his son had no right to be king. He took the sword and Sir Kay into St. Paul's church. Arthur went along with them, hoping he would not be rebuked for touching the sword. Sir Ector put a Bible into Sir Kay's hand and said, "Now tell me how you came by this sword." "Sir," said Sir Kay, "my brother Arthur gave it to me." Then Sir Ector turned to Arthur. "How did you get the sword?" he asked. I rode back to the lodging-house, which was locked, hence I could not bring Kay his sword. As I came back here, I saw this sword in the anvil in the stone, and I thought that my brother Kay should not be swordless. As this fine sword was lying unwanted in a churchyard, I pulled it from the stone and gave it to Kay. If I have done wrong, then I am sorry." Sir Ector looked long at the boy he had brought up as his own. "You have pulled the sword from the stone," he said, "and now you must be King of England." Arthur stared in amazement at the man he knew as his father. "Me?" he said. "Why should I be King of England?" "Because God wills it," replied Sir Kay, "and because you pulled the sword from the stone." "Well, it was easy. Anyone could do it," said Arthur. "Really?" said Sir Ector. "Then push it back in and let me try." Arthur climbed onto the huge stone and rammed the sword into the anvil. Sir Ector climbed up beside him and pulled at the handle of the sword, but he could not move it. "You try, Kay," Sir Ector said. Kay scrambled up onto the stone and with both his hands and all his strength tried to pull the sword free. He did not succeed. "Now you try, Arthur," said Sir Ector, his face and his voice as serious as Arthur had ever seen. Arthur put his hands upon the sword and easily pulled it free. Then Sir Ector and Sir Kay knelt before the young man. Arthur was distressed. "My father and my dear brother, why do you kneel before me?" he asked. "Arthur," replied Sir Ector, "I am not your father, and Kay is not your brother. We are not of the same blood. But to tell the truth, I never dreamed that you were as high-born as it seems you are." Sir Ector told how Arthur had been brought to him by Merlin, and Arthur wept, for he loved Sir Ector and Sir Kay dearly. Even if I am to be king, you will not leave me, will you?" he asked, and Sir Ector and Sir Kay promised to stay with Arthur as long as he needed them. The three of them went to the Archbishop of Canterbury and showed him the sword and told him how it had been gained. On the 12th day, the Archbishop called all the nobles together. Arthur put the sword back into the stone, and anyone who wished tried to pull it out. No one succeeded. Only Arthur could pull it free. Many of the great lords were angry and said it would be shame them to be ruled by a boy. They refused to agree that Arthur should be king. But from Candlemas to the next Christmas to the next Easter, the quarrels raged. But Arthur gathered clever, faithful men round him. He learned to lead men and to win battles, and eventually he became King of England. Sir Ector and Sir Kay stayed with Arthur all their lives, and Arthur ruled his realm from Camelot. He was a great and good king. Some people say that he never died, but is sleeping in a cave in the Welsh mountains, waiting to lead his country once again.